Assalamu alaikum everyone and welcome to the AlJawab podcast. Today's very important question is on women's rights under Islamic inheritance laws, and I have the pleasure of discussing this important question with Professor Jonathan Brown. So fasten your seatbelts and welcome to episode 7 of AlJawab podcast. Welcome everyone once again to this episode of AlJawab podcast. Very recently, Tunisia's president went out and said that he wants to change the inheritance laws in his country. Now you might be wondering, why does this matter at all to people around the world, or more specifically Muslims around the world? Now the reason why this is interesting and the reason why this stirred up a lot of heated conversations is because Tunisia's inheritance laws were based on the Islamic inheritance system. And the president of Tunisia, plans on moving from a Islamic system of inheritance to a secular system. And those who support the change say that this is necessary because the Islamic system or the Islamic laws of inheritance discriminate between females and males, such that males receive a greater proportion of whatever is inherited. On the other side, there are those obviously who say that this religious law is something that we are committed to as Muslims and we don't really have much say in whether we can accept them or not. In addition to the fact that if we truly look at these laws through a fair and objective lens, we see that they are not discriminatory or at least as objectionable as others claim. So it isn't very hard to see why many Muslims in this day and age struggle with this question because on one end, they want to remain devout and want to abide by the rulings of their religion, while at the same time they don't want to be seen as supporting discrimination against women or against any group of people for that matter. So it is definitely an important and sensitive question that I certainly don't have any answers for personally, but I have the pleasure of being joined by Professor Jonathan Brown for the second time to discuss this question. Professor Brown, thank you for joining me.
No problem. It's good to hear from you again.
So when it comes to the Islamic laws of inheritance, the main reason why this brings about a lot of sensitivity is because many people object to it on the basis that the rulings discriminate against Muslim women, such that a Muslim woman gets only half of what the Muslim man would get as an heir. And so the question that many Muslims face is, well, are we committed to this ruling? And if we are indeed committed to this ruling by virtue of us being Muslims, how can we explain or substantiate its wisdom?
I mean, what's really interesting about so basically, have these I would say like the Quranic and sort of Sharia system on inheritance is, I would call it like kind of agnatic plus is what I would call it. So, a lot of the default or they would call intestate inheritance rules of the Near Eastern world, whether it's Roman law or Persian law or pre-Islamic Arabian tradition, like the essentially inheritance would all go through to agnates. So agnates are people who are your patrilineal relatives, right? So your father, your brother, your sister, your father's brother, your father's sister, right? Your father's father, your father's mother, right? Your nephew, your brother's son, your brother's daughter, right? So these are all your agnatic relatives, like your sons, your daughters. So who are not your agnates, right? Your mother might not be your agnate, right? Your sister's kids. So your sister's kids would not be your agnates because they would be the agnates of your sister's kid's husband, right? So, there's like that would be like an agnatic system. Now the Islamic system is adjusts that, right? Because, for example, your mother inherits from you. In a like strictly agnatic system, your mother wouldn't inherit from you because your mother is just sort of like a almost like a incidental person. Like she's just sort of like the thing through which your father had her child. I'm not endorsing that, obviously. And you also in the Quran states that your grandparents both inherit, right? So what's interesting about that is that your grandparents both inherit 1/6. Like if you're sorry, not your grandparents, but the parents both inherit 1/6, right? So um, what's interesting about that is it's actually completely gender blind, right? So in that, if you're going to say, well, women always inherit less than half of what a man inherits in Islamic tradition, well, then why does the father and the husband both inherit 1/6? So one, it sort of adjusts that agnatic system. Second, it goes against that sort of this pattern that you see in a lot of other of the inheritance rulings in Islamic law, which is that the female inherits 1/2 of the male equivalent. And there's other things. I mean, where it's so. For example, your wife inherits automatically. That's also anti-agnatic. Your mother inherits automatically. That's also anti-agnatic. Um, and but you do see this 1/2 thing. So the daughter inherits half of what a son inherits. The wife inherits half of what her husband would inherit, et cetera, et cetera. So there's like a couple of this like 1/2 thing appears in a couple very important relationships, but it's also doesn't appear in some other important relationships. So it's not consistent. So I would say like the Islamic tradition is sort of like it's a system that uh, oftentimes favors males over females by giving them more, but doesn't always, and sometimes is blind between the two.
So in the cases where there is that favoritism that you just described, many people will say, well, that's objectionable. Like, why should we abide by a system that, endorses such discrimination?
Okay, well, I mean, first of all, well, let's like go backwards. Like, first of all, you don't have to abide by it in the sense that, okay, since the this I think this is like my theory, and people might not like my theory, but I'll just tell you my theory, and you can say what you will. But so basically, you can up to this comes from it's mentioned in the Quran, but it's really confirmed by the Prophet's hadith, which is that so up to 1/3 of your estate you can give as a bequest, like a wasiyah, to whoever. You can give it to NPR, National Public Radio. You can give it to a duck farmer on your block that you like. You could do whatever you want with it, except you can't give it to someone who's already an inheritor. So there's these Quranic inheritors, and some that are added also in hadiths that automatically inherit. Now that's actually, by the way, it's important because that means if you're an automatic inheritor, you cannot disinherit them. So my children are going to, inshallah, they're going to inherit from me. Even if I hate my kids, even if I say my kids are awful, I can't stand them, they never come and say hi to me, they're always going to inherit from me. And what that means is they don't have to worry about being disinherited by me. So however nice they are to me or not nice to me, that's their sincere approach. It's not because they're trying to get money from me. So basically, you cannot give part of this bequest to someone who already inherits unless all the heirs agree. So this is from a famous hadith of the Prophet. La wasiyata al-warith illa insha al-waratha. So you can't give any of this up to 1/3 bequest to anybody who already inherits unless all the heirs agree. Now, so actually, you could give your daughter the same amount as your son, as long as your son and the other heirs agreed, like your wife or whoever else was was around to inherit. Second, you could give your daughter a lifetime gift, an inter vivos gift, right? And that would be fine. Three, you could set up a waqf, a pious institution, which is what lots of Muslims, rich Muslims, did anyway throughout Islamic history. To the extent that for example, in like the Ottoman Empire in the 1600s, about 20% of land is under waqfs. in the post-Mongol Iran, about 1/3 of the land was waqfs. So this is very important. You might think, what the heck is Professor Brown talking about? Because, you know, Muslim scholars never ever had a problem with it. So they not only did they not have a problem with it, they were always very willing to help people find sort of schemes or tactics by which they could give whoever they wanted more inheritance than someone else, right? So if you think about like two kinds of legal ruling, there's sort of like tawqifi or ta'abudi rulings, and then there's like rulings that are ma'lula or mu'allala, that have like a reasoning behind them versus, you know, how many, why do you pray 5 times instead of 6 times? There's no reason, you know, this is just from God. Whereas, for example, why do you not ingest intoxicants? Well, there's a reason behind that, because of it, you know, makes you lose your inhibitions and behave badly or something like that. So there's two different kinds of rulings, and usually if you have a ruling that is tawqifi, right, or ta'abudi, there's nothing wrong with going around the letter of the law, so to speak, right? So if you have, I mean, this is a bad example, but because it sort of assumes some stuff, but let's just assume it, like Islamic finance, right? So if you say that in Islamic finance that it's a very formalistic thing where you have to give, you can't do riba, and riba is giving more of a quantity of something back to someone than they gave you, right? So, like, if you say that's the thing we're not allowed to do, I can do whatever I want. I can do like a double sale, or I can do this. I mean, anything we do, as long as we're not doing this formal thing, is halal, right? Now, of course, lots of people would say, no, that's not this is not tawqifi. This is not some like formalistic prohibition that God has put on us. There's a reason behind it, which is the exploitation of interest and things like that. But there's a lot of people who would think about riba as just being, there's very formal things that are riba, and as long as you don't do those formal things that are riba, what you're doing is halal, right? So that's a sort of example of like a tawqifi or ta'abudi approach to that type of ruling. Another type of ruling would be the sort of mu'allal or ma'lula ruling, which would be, you know, there is a ruling behind it. So I can't, for example, if I come up with I mean, let's just take the other approach to Islamic finance, right? Where if I say, I have found out a way to do this loan where technically we're not doing riba, they would say, no, this is not, this is, the ruling doesn't exist because there's this formal structure of the ruling. The ruling exists because there's a reason behind the ruling that is valid in this case, and you're still transgressing whatever reason that God had for prohibiting a certain action, right? So the question is, like, what is interest? Like, what is inheritance ruling? I mean, and if you look at Muslim scholars, I mean, earliest I've found this is in like the 1000s, but maybe someone wrote about this earlier. But so the Quran does not say why it gives people the inheritance divisions it does, right? And as far as I know, the Prophet doesn't say why. As far as I know. Now, Muslim scholars, again, as sort of the earliest I've seen is in the 1000s of the Common Era, they say, okay, well, why does the Quran have these rulings? Oh, okay, it's because we've heard these reasons before, and they're sort of pretty sensible reasons, which is that men are responsible for taking care of their female relatives. You know, a man has to pay mahr for himself, for his children, to his male children. If one of his female relatives isn't married, he has to take care of her, right? So basically, men carry more financial responsibility, and in fact, they actually, to do things like get married, they actually have to have financial capacity that their sisters or their sisters don't have, because their sisters are going to get taken care of by their husband, and it's their husband who's going to have to pay the mahr, and not the sister. So, but the important thing about these explanations, as far as I know, they're not. This isn't a divinely revealed reason. This is Muslim scholars doing their best, and I think in a pretty sensible way, to explain why these rulings exist. But here's the other possibility. The other possibility is that these rulings exist because God gave these rulings, and there's not necessarily some kind of ethical or moral or sort of socio-moral reasoning behind it per se, but that this is God's ruling. And the reason why I think that's almost more attractive as an explanation is because Muslim scholars never had a problem with finding ways around the inheritance regulation. So, like, for all we talk about Islamic finance, the Maliki school of law from the time of Malik in the Muwatta didn't buy this stuff at all. Like, all these other schools of law were saying, let's do the double sale, let's do al-tawarruq, or bay al-ina, or, al-murabaha, and all these other things, like bil-amr al-shira, and all these things. And the Maliki school just said, this is all, like, what are you guys talking about? This is what you're doing, just doing riba. Whereas, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, there's no Muslim school of law or that of any substance or of any significance, and no body of scholars of any significance ever said about this approach to getting around inheritance laws that, what are you guys doing? You're going into the spirit of the law. Because I just don't think I think that there's effective understanding that there was no spirit of the law behind this. These were rules that God had put in place. So they're thinking, like, if you can find a way around these rules, there's no problem. The other reason why I think that's convincing to me is that there's, it's a famous hadith in Sahih Muslim. Well, it's not famous, but it's a very interesting hadith in Sahih Muslim. It's also in the Sunan of al-Bayhaqi. There's two different narrations, two different versions of the hadith. And one version says, the Prophet ﷺ says, if you're going to give to your children, give gifts to your children, like while they're alive, it says, sawu bayn awladikum, right? So give the same amount to all of them, men and male and female children. And the other version says, i'dilu bayn awladikum, right? So be just between your children. So this is an interesting debate. Muslim, actually, Ibn Abidin, he has a whole treatise on this. It's fascinating. He says, because there's actually debate amongst scholars that when the Prophet says i'dilu, between your children, does he mean follow the Quranic shares, or does he mean be equal? So think about it, right? So this is a fascinating question. What he's asking is, if someone says to you, okay, I want you to divide, you have you have 5 children, and I want you to divide this pie between your children. Be just in how you divide the pie. What do you do? Like, what would come to your mind first? I mean, probably most people would say, okay, I'm going to give each kid the same amount of pie, right? Or at least that would be, but you could think to yourself, wait a second. Okay, the Quran is giving me certain instructions about inheritance. The Quran is from God. God is absolutely just, right? Therefore, if the Prophet is telling me to be just, it seems like I should follow the Quranic schema, or the Quranic pattern. But the fact that you have this other version of the hadith that says sawu bayn awladikum, be equal between your children, suggests that it leads a large one school of thought amongst Muslim scholars who are looking at this question to say, being just between your children here is to give them equal amounts. Now, this is fascinating because what it suggests is that, no one is doubting that God is absolutely just. That is absolutely certain, right? But the question is do the Quranic instructions on inheritance, are they a pattern or a model for justice, for God's justice that should be applied elsewhere, or are they a just exception to a division of resources that otherwise, in other situations, should be distributed by a more conventional or sort of routine understanding?
So essentially,
justice,
like, right? Should we reason by analogy and apply that, the inheritance rules, or is that just or are those rulings just specific to inheritance?
Yeah. So, for example, like, we can imagine, like, let's say we have, this is a bad example, but, like, let's say I have one kid who has super high metabolism, and my other kids have low metabolism, right? So I'm going to give this guy twice the amount of the other kids. In this case, I'm actually still being just, right? Because there's some specific situation. So are the Quranic rules, they're just because they come from God, but are they sort of an exceptional situation that shouldn't be the basis for an analogy in other situations, or are they the model of justice by which other situations should be measured? But the fact that you have these other hadiths that I talked about the inter vivos gifts to the children, suggests that there's like a more conventional understanding of justice, which would be justice as sort of equity and presumed, or justice as equality and also presumed equity amongst a group of people who are notional equals, right? So, I mean, we don't have any reason to think that one of our children somehow deserves more than the other child or something like that, right? Heaven done more work than the other child. So what this means is it seems, in my opinion, to give evidence, taken with the fact that alongside the fact that Muslim scholars never had a problem effectively subverting the Quranic rules, suggests that the Quranic rules are tawqifi/ta'abudi, and they don't have some socio-moral wisdom behind them per se, and therefore that's why Muslim scholars didn't have a problem going around those rules. Did everything I say make sense now?
Yeah. So essentially, what I understand is, historically, Muslim, like, this rule was applied formally in the sense that as long as you're not going against the letter of the law, you're in safe territory.
Yeah, but he wasn't even so. It wasn't so. Yeah, you can't come out and say, I don't care about the Quran's rules. I don't care about the Sharia. Right? What you do is you say, look, I have a daughter and a son. My son is a complete moron. My daughter is an absolute genius. I want to arrange for her to receive more money than him, or for her to receive equal money from him as him. And so I have all these devices, and I call Mufti Fulan, and Mufti Fulan says, yeah, I'll actually be happy to help you draft this. And what you're going to do is give a gift to we're going to get all your heirs together. They're all going to agree that you're going to give X percentage of your wasiya bequest to your daughter, and then she's going to have the same amount as your son, right? Now, and that's all that's all allowed under the direct instructions of the Prophet. Because he said, you can give wasiya to warith if the other people agree. You can give inter vivos gifts. You can create waqf. So none of this stuff is, everything I've done is totally by the Sharia, but it's actually acting to subvert those Quranic directions.
Mm-hmm. So this leads me to a few questions. The first, regarding to the hadith which you cite, was that referring to what you give to your children during your lifetime? Because there might be an argument that the words of the Prophet ﷺ in that hadith was referring to a specific scenario, which is during your lifetime. And as soon as we enter into a situation of death and inheritance, then that doesn't apply, and we just stick to the inheritance rules that are dictated in the Quran.
Yeah, so it's definitely, the hadith is definitely talking about the stuff given during lifetime, right? So there's no, like, that's very clear in the hadith. The debate is, so the main version of a hadith actually says, "I'azadu bayna awladikum." So be just amongst your children. So then the question is, does adl here mean equal or following the Quranic shares? And the scholars who say it should follow the Quranic shares would say, well, we should follow the Quranic shares because God is just, and because this situation is analogous to your division of your estate after your death. The scholars who disagree with that and say, no, justice here means being equal, say, well, it's equal because you have this other version that says give equally between your children, right? So one group says this is analogous to the distribution of estate after death because it's basically your money going to your children, right? And the other one is that these situations are just not analogous. There's no reason to assume that um, you're making a decision during life about giving away resources as opposed to something that's happening after your death. Like these situations are not they're different enough that you shouldn't assume that they're that's like when I'm if we were talking about money, that's one thing. But let's say again we go back to the pie example. Like you could just say that my division of anything between my children is somehow should be done on the basis of my of the Quranic laws on inheritance because I'm giving something to my children, and that's analogous to the division of my estate after death, right? So you sort of like you get to the point where like, well, if you're not talking about money, if you're talking about giving them like sheep or something like that, well, how are we really going to go and treat all our inter vivos gifts to our children as something that should be analogized on by inheritance? So that was like the other argument, which is just these you sort of this is not really there's not a strong enough basis to treat this as something that is directly linked and analogically to the division of estate after death.
So it seems to me what's happening is so the rules of inheritance are what you can call rules that are ready on the shelf that you can pick up and easily apply, but you can sort of contract out of these rules or somehow find a way out of them. That's perfectly legitimate.
Yeah, and so but to I would say this is just my argument. I could be wrong. This is all like Jonathan Brown argument. If people don't have a problem with it, or if people can prove me wrong, I'll be very happy to retract my what I'm saying. But the fact that you're really left with a question, which is let's say these are off the shelf rules, or these are like sort of intestate rules. Now we don't want to say that they're bereft of sort of moral or justice content, right? Because even if you go to like intestate rules of inheritance or probate rules or something like that in any society, they actually, in my opinion, they actually tell you a lot about how that society thinks. Like, you know, even if almost everybody in society has a will, like the rules that a society has, if they have them, of kind of intestate division of resources, so the person who doesn't have a will, that really tells you about how it's almost like this extremely conservative way lasting from that society's or remaining from that society's past about how it thinks about relationships and whose relationships matter and who should receive wealth after someone's death. So we don't want to say that these Quranic rules somehow have no justice content or moral content. I think they do, and I think Muslim scholars were not dreaming stuff up or sort of delusional when they said, "Oh, well, a brother gets double their sister because that brother's going to have to get married and pay his own mahar, and then he's going to have to take care of his sister if his sister doesn't get married." And so, there's all sorts of reasons there, but that we shouldn't perhaps see this as a prescription for how we should think about people's value in relationships overall, to the extent that everything we do is now dictated by this idea that the daughter is only worth half of the son.
I just find interesting that like this, and this is the first time I hear this argument. I find it very interesting because when you hear people talking about the rules of inheritance, they say the opposite of what you say, and they say these are not umur ta'budiyya, these are not rulings about worship. These are ahkam or rulings ma'qulat al-ma'na, so we can actually find the reasoning behind it, and that's the premise on which they say that the inheritance was divided up because women didn't have financial responsibilities. Now they do, so now we can change up the rules. So
my response to that would be, like, that is a very reasonable response. Like, that is, like, no one can be faulted for coming to that conclusion, because you have a clear pattern in the Quran,
mm-hmm.
right? And the sort of hadith additions to this, which are, again, sort of mostly in the Quran. You have a very clear pattern. You see then what kind of are the things that Muslim men have to do versus Muslim women. And let's not even get into sort of, as a man supposed to pay the electricity bill and the water bill, or his wife can, forget about that. The man has to pay a mahar, and the woman doesn't have to pay a mahar, right? So you can just go to sort of like just very bare bones costs that are incurred by a man versus a woman, and the man has more costs than the woman. Like, even if everyone's paying half the electricity bill, okay? So this is a totally reasonable approach. But my response would be, okay, first of all, where is that stated? Now, of course, there's lots of rulings. Even let's say the rulings on intoxication, right? There's not, the Quran doesn't say, wine is bad because it makes you act stupidly and drive drunk and things like that. So but these are pretty clearly inferable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not. But my question is, if we don't have, as far as I know, we don't have anywhere, and I could be wrong, but I don't think we have anywhere an explanation from in the Quran or the Sunnah of why these inheritance rules are the way they are.
Yes.
But what we do have is these hadiths about the inter vivos gifts, and we have the scholarly practice about finding ways around the Quranic rules.
Mm-hmm.
Those two things, to me, strike me as they're not binding, but they're what is it called? Persuasive. They're persuasive.
So the argument does sound very reasonable, but my problem with this argument is that it has problematic implications, because as soon as we start looking at rulings and searching for the reasons behind the rulings, we're just going to start willy-nilly saying, times have changed, let's change the ruling, and you will eventually end up with a very different religion, because people will just be changing rulings as they see fit, because, you know what, times have changed. So don't you think that this sort of reasoning opens up a door that we will have a hard time shutting in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so this is, if you wanted to sort of summarize, I think if you want to summarize the difference between kind of progressive Islam / Islamic modernism on one hand, and sort of traditional reformist but traditional Islam to sort of traditional Islam on the other hand, the difference between the two approaches is traditional Muslim scholars, even sort of reform-oriented ones, assume that, if you want to argue that a ruling in the Quran or the Sunnah should change over time, you have to have very strong evidence that shows why that ruling came and that ruling was meant to change over time.
Mm-hmm. You can't just infer
right?
that,
Yeah, you can't just say, I think that this is because the society was like that. Now the society's not like that, and therefore let's change it, right? So, men are supposed to lead women in prayer. You don't say, well, this is, what happens if you have a man who's ignorant and a woman who's really knowledgeable? A man who memorized 2-3 verses of the Quran versus a woman who's a hafidha, right? So, we don't have any, unless we have some reason really to go, some evidence from the Quran, the Sunnah, some strong evidence that suggests that we're supposed to be altering this ruling based on context, we're not going to do that. Whereas the kind of modernist or progressive view would say, we assume that every ruling in the Quran or the Sunnah, except maybe just the most super taboo-y ones, like pork eating or something, we assume that every ruling is based on some contextual explanation, and if that context changes, then the ruling should change.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you're completely right in saying that, wait a second, if you're saying, let's look at the situation behind this, and the situation's changing, so the ruling should change, therefore we're going to end up with a totally different understanding of religion. I agree with you 100%. You could say, well, the only reason marriage is necessary is because people sort of needed to have some way of keeping track of who was having sex, and now we have paternity tests and all this other thing, so we don't really need marriage anymore, right? And plus, people don't want to have kids anyway. They just get married for companionship, things like that. So, you could make lots of arguments, right? You could say, oh, the Quran doesn't really want, it's not saying that, the Prophet's not saying that homosexual sex is wrong. This is just, it was really about coercive sex. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is really about coercive sex. It's not about homosexuality or something. So the prohibition on homosexuality doesn't apply anymore. So, you could make all sorts of arguments. But the problem with that approach is that Muslim scholars have always been very careful about, or have generally been, not always, but generally been very careful about sort of trying to come up with explanations for rulings that they felt were strong enough that those rulings should change if the explanations didn't apply, right? And that's a degree of caution they had about the revelation. Like they don't, if God comes and reveals a message to people and sends a prophet to people to teach them and guide them, you don't just sit there willy-nilly throwing out that guidance just because you think things have changed. Right?
So, and that's why I find the theory that you posed earlier about about the inheritance laws, which is why I find it, I don't know, I'm not qualified to make any serious conclusions, but
you find it fishy and
no,
unconvincing. I completely understand.
No. I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm saying I find it more convincing than the other arguments I hear because it doesn't involve these far-fetched inferences about times have changed.
Yeah. So I mean, like if Muslims, so this is if Muslim scholars, again, I could be wrong, but as far as I know, if we had any evidence that Muslim scholars had been hostile to people trying to find ways around the Quranic rules of inheritance, we would have much more argument to say that these rules were really rooted in a specific sort of socio-moral understanding of how society was supposed to be structured in the distribution of resources, right? But we don't have that. So what we have is we don't really have evidence for, it strikes me that this is a lot more like pork than like usury.
Yeah. In the sense that it's
a
formal rule.
Yeah, it's very formal. It's not, you don't have a sort of functional or rational or utilitarian element behind it or something, right? This is a very formal, but by the way, I think, by the way, one might argue sort of all intestate schemes is that they're sort of this bare bones way that a society says we're gonna envision our resources, our distribution of resources after death, right? And of course, families are complex. Of course, we might end up in a situation where I have 6 ex-wives, 5 idiot sons who can barely walk and who should never be left alone, and I have 13 genius daughters who 5 of them have been awarded Nobel Prizes, and 2 of my sisters are no good schemers, and 5 of my brothers are like we could just imagine the immense complexity of any family situation in any village or town and throughout the Muslim world throughout 14 centuries. And of course, you want an enormous flexibility in how people are going to deal with their inheritance, right? And it would be kind of, it would be almost silly to say that you're going to be able to provide just answers for all these potential situations if you can't have a very flexible way of addressing like how someone is going to distribute their estate.
Professor Brown, I wish I can take this interview, take up more time with this, but I took enough of your time, and this was extremely insightful. So I want to thank you once again for joining me.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I'll talk to you later, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much, Professor Brown. And thank you to everyone else who was listening into this episode. I'm sure that this is a question that sparks various and divergent points of view, so please feel free to send your follow-up questions and to engage in respectful discussion in the comment section below. And also be sure to like and share the episode and subscribe to either the SoundCloud or iTunes channels. Other than that, thank you very much, and until next time, Assalamu alaikum.